Three officers is not a coincidence, it is a signal, and it is the kind of signal that makes seasoned investigators pause because numbers matter when power is being exercised quietly. Three constables walking into a Sandton home before sunrise is not about logistics, it is about message, and that message is what should trouble anyone who cares about how authority is used in this country. At 6:47 a.m., when most people are still asleep, the machinery of the state arrived at the private residence of one of South Africa's most recognizable figures, and from that moment the story stopped being about one person and started becoming about a system. This is not just about Tandy McQueen, no matter how much some would prefer to frame it that way. It is about how investigations unfold when they brush too close to sensitive networks, how narratives are shaped before facts are fully understood, and how fear and pressure often travel faster than truth. When police action intersects with celebrity, politics, and money, the public is left trying to separate legitimate law enforcement from institutional overreach, and that line is never as clear as officials claim. For more than 2 decades, Tandy McQueen has represented something powerful in South African public life. On screen, she played a character who stood up to corruption, who challenged abuse of power, who asked uncomfortable questions. Off-screen, she built a business that became a major player in the creative economy, employing hundreds and exporting South African stories to global audiences. That background matters, not because it grants immunity, but because it explains why a raid like this lands differently and why the implications go far beyond one warrant. The morning of September 12th did not exist in isolation, and that is where this story demands patience and attention. Long before police knocked on that door, there was already a trail of events that pointed towards something much larger than a single tender or a single department. The death of Benani Sithole was the first crack in the surface, even though authorities were quick to smooth it over with familiar language about opportunistic crime and bad luck. A procurement officer responsible for evaluating multi-million rand tenders is not just another civil servant. That position sits at the intersection of money, influence, and political pressure, and anyone who has worked in government knows how contested that space can be. When Benani Sithole told his sister that he was scared, that he had uncovered something fraudulent, that he had been threatened, those words should have triggered alarm bells far louder than they did. Why did they not, and who decided they were not worth amplifying? The official explanation of a robbery gone wrong collapses under even mild scrutiny. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed, and the items most likely to be targeted were left untouched. These are facts, not speculation, and they sit uncomfortably with the narrative presented to the public. When explanations do not fit evidence, it is reasonable to ask why, and whether convenience played a role in closing the case quickly. Then came the SIU announcement, confirming that tender fraud amounting to hundreds of millions of rand was under investigation within the same department where Sithole worked. That timing matters. Investigations of that scale do not appear overnight. They are built over months, sometimes years, meaning concerns were likely already circulating before his death. Does that change how you interpret what happened, and should it change how seriously we interrogate the official story? The death of Zanel Domini added another layer of unease. Another individual connected to the same web of contracts, another rapid explanation, another push toward closure. Domestic violence is tragically common and must never be dismissed, but when cases involving powerful economic interests resolve with suspicious speed, questions naturally follow. External pressure, as alleged by her lawyer, is not a small claim, and silence around it only deepens doubt. By the time police arrived at Tandy McQueen's home, the pattern was already forming, even if it had not yet been named. A dead procurement officer, a dead business executive, a suspended CFO, and now a high-profile raid. Each event on its own can be explained away, but together they create a narrative that is difficult to ignore. At what point do coincidences stop being coincidental, and who gets to decide that? The connection through Lindile raid is not an accusation. It is a factual overlap that investigators themselves would be expected to examine. Senior officials who move between departments carry institutional memory, relationships, and influence with them. When the same name appears across multiple tender approvals in different departments, scrutiny is not only justified, it is required. That is how serious anti-corruption work is done. What makes this moment so delicate is that scrutiny, when applied unevenly, can easily become punishment by association. A raid is not a neutral act. It carries symbolic weight, it invites public judgment, and it can permanently alter reputations regardless of outcome. That is why the question of necessity matters so much here. Why force entry into a home when cooperation was likely, and what did authorities believe could only be obtained through such a display of power? Search warrants required justification, and somewhere there is an affidavit explaining why this intrusion was necessary. That document holds answers the public deserves to see, because transparency is the only antidote to suspicion. Without it, speculation fills the vacuum, and speculation rarely lands gently on anyone involved. Supporters of the investigation will argue that no one should be shielded from inquiry, and they are right. Accountability must be blind to status and popularity. But accountability also requires proportionality and care, especially when the state exercises its most coercive powers. How do we ensure that investigations pursue truth rather than theater? There is a deeper anxiety beneath this story, one that many South Africans feel but struggle to articulate. It is the fear that corruption cases are managed rather than resolved, that attention is redirected towards safer targets while the core of the problem remains untouched. When high-profile actions are taken without visible follow-through, people begin to wonder whether justice is being delayed. Media silence has played its own role in amplifying that unease. This is the kind of story that should dominate front pages, that should be dissected by investigative desks with resources and reach. Instead, coverage has been cautious, fragmented, almost hesitant. Is that restraint about responsibility, or is it about avoiding backlash and legal risk in a country where powerful interests do not appreciate uncomfortable questions? In the end, this story is not asking you to choose sides or to declare guilt. It is asking you to stay alert, to resist easy narratives, and to remember how often systems rely on public fatigue to survive scrutiny. If we stop paying attention now, if we accept partial answers and procedural language as enough, then the outcome has already been decided without us. And so the final question lingers, uncomfortably and deliberately, long after the footage ends and the headlines fade. In a country where corruption is both loudly condemned and quietly accommodated, who benefits most when the truth remains just out of reach, and how long are we willing to live with that?